Princess Anne did not need to raise her voice. When she saw it, she responded the only way institutions do when they feel exploited.
Something explosive happened behind palace walls. Something so unsettling that when Princess Anne's new documentary, the documentary finally exposed it, the reaction wasn't curiosity, it was shock. Because what began as whispers about a recording incident suddenly expanded into a far darker possibility that the story the public believed for years might have been carefully engineered piece by piece, moment by moment, emotion by emotion. And when that possibility surfaced, the entire royal drama surrounding Meghan didn't just look controversial anymore, it looked strategic. What the documentary unveiled next didn't simply raise eyebrows, it detonated suspicion like a wrecking ball through a glass palace corridor. Because the film didn't stop at describing an alleged recording incident involving the Queen's private archive, it claimed something even more unsettling happened afterward. According to the documentary, audio surfaced of Meghan in a palace corridor moments later, speaking rapidly on the phone, energized, focused, issuing instructions with the precision of someone managing a production rather than preserving a memory. And here's the part that made viewers freeze. The call, the film alleges, wasn't sentimental. It wasn't reflective. It wasn't someone overwhelmed by royal history. Instead, the conversation reportedly revolved around editing, slicing audio into segments, shaping fragments into something usable. And the implication of that detail? Absolutely chilling. Because a recording is not truth. A recording is raw material. Words can be clipped, pauses removed, context erased, sentences rearranged. Meaning can flip entirely depending on what remains and what disappears. Suddenly, a private conversation becomes a constructed narrative. Suddenly, a fragment sounds like a declaration. And when the voice involved belongs to the Queen herself, the consequences are explosive. The documentary leaned heavily into that possibility, suggesting that if someone possessed private audio of the monarch and understood how editing works, they could theoretically reshape perception itself. Not by inventing lies, but by rearranging truth. A phrase removed here, a clarification erased there, a pause tightened, a tone sharpened. And what remains sounds like something entirely different. That isn't documentation. That's narrative engineering. And that's when the film pivoted from a single shocking moment to something far more disturbing: patterns. Because one incident can be dismissed as misunderstanding. One awkward moment can be called miscommunication. But repeated behaviors begin to look deliberate. And according to testimony introduced in the documentary, 2 palace employees described interactions with Meghan that followed a very particular pattern: friendly conversations, warm smiles, confidential tones. Then subtle information dropped into the discussion like seeds of suspicion. One employee reportedly told investigators that Meghan privately suggested another staff member had been criticizing them, questioning their competence, doubting their performance behind their back. Then, separately, the second employee allegedly heard the same story about the first. At first, the comments sounded harmless, almost sympathetic, but the result was tension, quiet mistrust, a sense that colleagues were secretly undermining each other. Psychologists watching the documentary immediately recognized the tactic: triangulation, a manipulation method where 2 individuals are fed selective or false information about each other, creating conflict that appears organic. And once that conflict exists, it becomes evidence of dysfunction. The environment suddenly looks toxic. People appear hostile. But according to the documentary, both employees later confirmed something shocking. Neither had ever criticized the other at all. The hostility had been manufactured, subtle, quiet, ingenious. Because you don't need to fabricate a scandal if you can engineer circumstances that create one naturally. The documentary's argument was blunt. If you need proof of a hostile environment but none exists, you create the friction yourself. Then you point to the chaos as evidence. From there, the film widened the lens, shifting from palace drama to the mechanics of modern media warfare. Because the monarchy, for generations, operated on one guiding principle: never complain, never explain. Let dignity and time speak for themselves. That strategy worked in the era of newspapers and scheduled broadcasts. But the digital world doesn't reward silence. It rewards emotion, speed, viral storytelling. According to analysts featured in the documentary, Meghan may have understood that shift better than the institution itself. In today's attention economy, controlling perception matters more than controlling facts. And perception is born from emotion. A powerful interview filled with vulnerability can reach millions in minutes. Tears, pain, accusations, heartbreak. The emotional impression forms instantly. Weeks later, when contradictory information emerges, it struggles to gain gain traction because people don't like revising their first emotional judgment. Admitting you were misled feels uncomfortable, so what happens instead? New evidence gets reframed as retaliation, institutional pushback, proof that the victim narrative was correct all along. The documentary described this as narrative dominance. Speak first, speak emotionally, anchor the story so deeply in public sympathy that any later contradiction appears cruel or defensive. And if that interpretation is correct, it explains why certain interviews appeared exactly when they did. Because according to Princess Anne's account presented in the film, something inside the palace shifted quietly after the alleged archive corridor incident. Trust reportedly eroded. Staff began documenting interactions more carefully. Access tightened, not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. And if someone sensed that scrutiny increasing behind the scenes, the smartest move would be obvious. Move first. Flood the media space with your version before anyone else can introduce theirs. Frame the narrative emotionally so that any later challenge looks like persecution. Then the documentary dropped another uncomfortable possibility. What if those interviews weren't simply about healing or sharing personal truth? What if they were strategic positioning, reputation insurance? According to analysts interviewed in the film, building a powerful public identity as a victim creates a shield. Once millions sympathize with you, anyone who criticizes you risks appearing heartless. And that dynamic doesn't just influence public opinion, it influences money, contracts, partnerships. Because by the time Princess Anne's documentary aired, Meghan had built a massive commercial ecosystem around her story, streaming deals, book contracts, podcasts, speaking engagements, corporate partnerships. Every one of those deals depended on one fragile foundation: narrative dominance. And that is where the story becomes less about royal gossip and more about power. Because when a counter-narrative suddenly enters the public arena, especially one backed by documentation, testimony, and alleged recordings, corporations begin asking a different question. What if the story flips? Silence followed the broadcast. Not dramatic press conferences, not loud denunciations, just subtle shifts. Meetings postponed, contracts reviewed, emails sent quietly behind closed doors. In corporate circles, that kind of silence is deafening. And according to the documentary, that silence began on a California morning that may have changed everything. That California morning arrived quietly, almost deceptively calm. But the documentary suggests that behind closed doors, it triggered a chain reaction few people outside corporate boardrooms could immediately see. Because while headlines focused on the explosive revelations inside Princess Anne's documentary, the real tremors were happening somewhere else entirely. Inside legal departments, corporate strategy meetings, and risk assessment briefings where Meghan's commercial empire was suddenly being reevaluated with a very different lens. For years, the value of that empire had rested on one powerful asset: narrative certainty. Her story had emotional clarity, public sympathy, and cultural momentum. Brands understood exactly what they were buying when they partnered with her. They were aligning themselves with a figure presented as courageous, resilient, and bold enough to challenge one of the world's oldest institutions. That image was marketable. It attracted audiences. It sold books, podcasts, and streaming subscriptions. But the moment Princess Anne's documentary introduced a competing narrative supported by testimony, alleged audio, and internal documentation, the calculus shifted instantly. Because in corporate terms, certainty turning into uncertainty is the most dangerous transformation possible. Companies don't fear controversy as much as they fear unpredictability. And if the foundation of Meghan's public identity could suddenly be questioned, even slightly, every partnership tied to that identity entered a new category: potential liability. That is why the documentary emphasizes the subtle signals that reportedly followed the broadcast. Projects paused without explanation. Meetings quietly postponed. Contract renewals delayed. No public accusations, no dramatic severing of ties, just careful silence while companies reassessed the situation. In the business world, that silence is rarely neutral. It means executives are asking uncomfortable questions behind closed doors. What if the narrative flips? What if new evidence gains traction? What if public sympathy shifts? Because when perception changes, market value can collapse with shocking speed. Financial analysts interviewed in the film described this moment using a term from investment strategy: reputation arbitrage. It refers to the instant when someone's perceived value swings from asset to risk. And unlike a slow decline, reputation arbitrage tends to happen abruptly. One day a figure represents cultural momentum. The next day, they represent uncertainty. The documentary argues that Meghan's brand was uniquely vulnerable to this phenomenon because it was built almost entirely around narrative authority. Her influence came from controlling the story. Her credibility came from emotional dominance in the public conversation. And once Princess Anne's documentary introduced the possibility that the narrative might be incomplete or strategically engineered, that dominance began to wobble. The film illustrates this with the moment many viewers found most explosive: not a photograph, not a testimony, but sound. According to the documentary, audio allegedly captured captured Meghan speaking in a palace corridor immediately after the archive recording incident, her voice animated, energetic, issuing instructions to someone on the other end of the phone. What stunned viewers was the reported subject of the conversation. The film claims she wasn't discussing preserving the Queen's words or honoring royal history. Instead, she was allegedly talking about production, about editing, about shaping the audio into something usable later. The implication struck like lightning because anyone familiar with media production understands what that means. Audio is malleable. Words can be isolated, pauses removed, fragments rearranged until the meaning shifts entirely. A sentence taken out of context can sound like a declaration. A clarification cut away can turn nuance into controversy. The documentary framed this possibility in stark terms, suggesting that possessing a private recording of the Queen combined with editing capability could theoretically allow someone to reshape public perception of what she said. That idea transformed the alleged archive incident from a curiosity into something far more serious, the potential weaponization of trust. And from there, the film returned to the pattern argument that had been building throughout the narrative. Because if the archive incident were the only questionable episode, it could still be dismissed as misunderstanding. But the documentary claimed it was part of a broader pattern involving strategic emotional displays, internal workplace manipulation, and calculated media timing. Princess Anne's account within the film suggests that after the corridor incident, something changed inside the palace even if the public never saw it. Staff began documenting interactions more carefully. Security protocols tightened. Access to certain areas became more controlled. None of this happened loudly. Institutions like the monarchy rarely respond dramatically in real time. They respond methodically, documenting quietly while assessing the situation. According to the documentary, Meghan may have sensed that shift in atmosphere, the subtle tightening of scrutiny around her. And if she suspected internal concerns were being recorded, waiting would be risky. Because if those concerns ever surfaced publicly first, they could damage her credibility. The smartest move in that scenario would be to move ahead of the story, to define the narrative before anyone else could. The film portrays this as the moment where public interviews, emotional revelations, and escalating claims began appearing rapidly in the media. From describing struggles adapting to royal life to discussing feelings of isolation and vulnerability, each new disclosure expanded the emotional arc of the story while simultaneously making rebuttal more dangerous for the palace. Because responding to someone presenting themselves as vulnerable carries reputational risk. Criticism can appear cruel. Silence, on the other hand, can appear like confirmation. The documentary argues that the monarchy became trapped in that dilemma. Their traditional approach of restraint allowed Meghan's narrative to dominate public perception for years. By the time any counter-evidence might surface, millions of people had already emotionally invested in her story. And emotional investment is extremely difficult to reverse. This is where the film introduces one of its most uncomfortable themes: emotional weaponization. Princess Anne does not claim that Meghan's emotions were fake. Instead, the documentary suggests something more complex and perhaps more unsettling: that Meghan may have understood how emotion functions in the modern media environment better than anyone around her. Tears, vulnerability, visible distress can powerfully influence perception. Psychologists interviewed in the film describe a concept called strategic emotionality, the ability to display emotion in ways that guide interpretation and shape audience reactions. Most people experience emotion spontaneously.